From 1830 to 1850, the Cherokee people and many other Native American tribes living near the eastern coast of the United States were forcefully removed from their homelands and relocated to the west of the Mississippi River in an event that became known as the Trail of Tears. This era was later called the Removal Era. The cruelty of the Native Americans' plight is highlighted by an account of a bystander to the Trail of Tears which states, "Even aged females, apparently nearly ready to drop into the grave, were traveling with heavy burdens attached to their back on sometimes frozen ground and sometimes muddy streets, with no covering for the feet except what nature had given them."
However, the cruelty towards the Native Americans had originally begun many years before. Long before the European settlers arrived in the New World, Native Americans had lived freely along the eastern coast of North America. Only once the settlers came to North America and claimed the land for themselves did the Native Americans begin to feel threatened and actively protect their land. Such an example is evident through the Treaty of Hopewell from 1785, the first treaty between the Cherokee people and European settlers that ensured the natives that their land was protected. However, the Cherokees' attempts to integrate into white society by creating a constitution and a government still resulted in great discrimination. Then on May 28, 1830, these native people who had lived on these lands for such a long time found themselves forced from their lands as a result of the Indian Removal Act signed by President Andrew Jackson.
When the United States of America was established at the start of the Revolutionary War, the Founding Fathers gathered together and wrote up the Declaration of Independence, in which they described their grievances with the British monarchy's rule. Within the Declaration, the Founding Fathers established the idea that a government's main responsibilities serve to protect the rights of its people, stating that all men are created equal and are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. However, the Founding Fathers' image of America's rights extended only as far as its white men, so when it came to dealing with the existence of the Native Americans, there is very little room for cooperation.
Early in the Union, President James Monroe spoke upon the issue of Indian removal, stating that the removal of the Indian tribes is of very high importance to our Union, and may be accomplished on conditions and in a manner to promote the interest and happiness of those tribes. Despite a seemingly peaceful attempt at cooperation, Monroe's words served to highlight the main interest of the United States concerning the removal of the Native Americans. Through events such as the Cherokee Nation versus Georgia court case, Worcester v. Georgia court case, and the Treaty of New Dakota during the removal era, the actions of the United States government indicate that despite its established rights, it was never responsible for applying them to the Native Americans.
In 1831, the Cherokee Nation versus Georgia case took place in the Supreme Court. In the wake of the Indian Removal Act, the Cherokee Nation brought the state of Georgia into court, hoping that it would prevent the state from forcefully removing its people from their lands. To protect themselves from the American government's removal policies, the Cherokee Nation, with lawyer William Wirt, took the state of Georgia to court with the hope of receiving protection or independence from the state's legislature. The case was soon brought up to the United States Supreme Court, where Wirt argued that the effect of Georgia's enforced laws would destroy the lives and history of the Cherokee people, stating that the legislation of Georgia proposes to annihilate the Cherokee. If those laws be fully executed, there will be no Cherokee boundary, no Cherokee Nation, no Cherokee lands, no Cherokee treaties, leaving nothing but the monuments of our history of the enormous injustice that has been practiced towards a friendly nation. The argument posed by the natives explains the existing harshness of the government and that if further actions of Cherokee removal were taken, not only would the tribes be devastated and forced to migrate on foot, but a rich culture that has been cultivated for centuries would be destroyed for the purpose of expansion.
In spite of this argument, the Supreme Court favored the state of Georgia, judging that it had no legal authority to hear the dispute because Indian tribes are domestic dependent nations and not foreign nations. This unjust decision to label the Cherokee tribes as domestic dependent allowed for both the state of Georgia and President Andrew Jackson to continue their mission of removing the Cherokee people from their lands, and as a result failed to consider the personal rights of the Cherokee which they should have received once they were integrated into the United States. Such actions indicate that the Cherokee were never intended to be included in the freedoms of the United States, highlighting both the discriminatory nature of the American judicial system regarding the Native Americans and the repeated lack of consideration by the federal government to uphold and enforce constitutional responsibilities. The failure of the Supreme Court to take responsibility for the Native Americans during the Cherokee Nation versus Georgia case would ultimately ensure the destruction of the Cherokee people, confirming that the rights of the United States had not been created for them.
In 1832, another Supreme Court case concerning the situation of the Native Americans was conducted. The Worcester v. Georgia case was a landmark Supreme Court case that involved the arrest of Samuel Worcester, a missionary who had violated a policy regarding the act of living in Cherokee lands as a white man. The root cause of the court case stems from a law passed by the state of Georgia in 1830, which says that all white persons residing within the limits of the Cherokee Nation, without a license or permit from His Excellency the Governor, and who shall not have taken the oath hereinafter required, shall be guilty of a high misdemeanor. The law features a dehumanizing attitude toward the Native Americans with the idea that a white person must obtain a permit and take an oath to interact with them, heavily implying that the Cherokee did not belong.
Ultimately, missionaries such as Samuel Worcester, who had been living in Cherokee lands when the law was passed, were arrested for breaking it. Worcester describes the experience, stating, "I rode thence 10 miles to where Colonel Nelson was. There I found Reverend Mr. Trott, a Methodist missionary, and a Cherokee by the name of Proctor. Proctor was chained to the wall of the house by the neck and had another chain around his ankle." Worcester's account of the arrest details the violent actions towards both the white missionaries and the Cherokee people they were in contact with. This disdain toward the natives and their white accomplices indicates that the United States was against the civilization of the Cherokee, believing them to be racially inferior and better off just removed entirely.
Eventually, the issue would be brought to the Supreme Court, resulting in a landmark case. This time, the Supreme Court contradicted their ruling from the Cherokee Nation versus Georgia case, giving the Cherokee the designation of a sovereign nation in an attempt by Chief Justice John Marshall to protect the tribe. However, Andrew Jackson, openly defying the Supreme Court, decided to disregard the decision. To Chief Justice John Marshall, Jackson stated, "Marshall has made his decision, and let him enforce it." The president's actions indicate a hostile attitude towards the Native Americans. In ignoring the decision, Jackson violated the rights of the Native Americans while also expressing a desire to remove them from the land as quickly as possible, suggesting that America's rights were never created for the people like the Cherokee.
The lack of rights exercised by the Native Americans, as expressed by the Worcester v. Georgia case, can be viewed in comparison to the plight of the Africans subjected to the American slavery system, as both groups had not been provided the rights guaranteed by the Declaration of Independence and were constantly subjected to oppressive treatment. According to historian Gerard Magliocchio, the Cherokees' attempts to fit into the changing world of the United States through the help of missionaries were completely neglected, leading them to become a clear group for examining the equity issues in the United States, as well as inspiration for an abolitionist movement against slavery. Although the rights of the Native Americans were never fully realized and their place in the United States was disregarded, the idea that their struggle inspired the rebellion of another minority group indicates all the more that they were never meant to coexist within the United States in general. Ultimately, the outcome of the Worcester v. Georgia case would bring the United States closer to the removal of the Cherokee and their native counterparts, bringing the removal era closer to its climax.
A few years later, in 1835, Andrew Jackson enacted one of the most devastating and fraudulent actions toward the situation of the Cherokee, with the creation of the Treaty of New Dakota, which catalyzed Cherokee removal. As evidenced by his signing of the Indian Removal Act, Jackson has always been determined to complete the removal of the Native Americans. On March 16, 1835, Jackson sent a letter to the Cherokee Nation, hoping it would convince them to stop resisting and to give up their land, stating, "Listen to me, therefore, while I tell you that you cannot remain where you are now. Circumstances that cannot be controlled and which are beyond the reach of human laws render it impossible that you can flourish in the midst of a civilized community. You have but one remedy within your reach, and that is to remove to the west and join your countrymen who are already established there." Jackson's words follow a relatively condescending tone in which he implies a belief that the Native Americans were uncivilized and greatly inferior to the white people of the United States. Jackson's letter ultimately indicates that the Native Americans would never be able to fit into the United States, that they essentially did not belong and would be removed sooner or later, disregarding whether or not they agreed.
A few months later, with the help of an independent group of Cherokee Bank supporters led by Major John Ridge, Jackson would successfully have the Treaty of New Dakota signed, effectively removing the entire Cherokee Nation from their land, through the representation of just a small group of men. As Jackson outlines in the treaty, the Cherokee Nation hereby cede, relinquish, and convey to the United States all the lands owned, claimed, or possessed by them east of the Mississippi River, and hereby release all their claims upon the United States for spoliations of every kind for, and in consideration of, a sum of $5 million. Jackson's enactment of the Treaty of New Dakota represents the product of his defiance toward the decision of the Worcester v. Georgia case. As President of the United States, Jackson did everything in his power to prevent the Native Americans from receiving the rights promised to the people of the country. Many people of the Cherokee Nation would openly defy the Treaty of New Dakota, refusing to leave their homes. However, this would only result in the violent and forceful removal of the Cherokee Nation by soldiers who treated the natives as if they were not human. In conclusion, despite their resistance toward the removal, the Cherokee Nation was disregarded and exploited to the highest degree by the American government, whose main goal was to only obtain their land, implying that the Native Americans had never been included within the rights of the United States.
It is clear that through the careless nature of the United States government regarding their fluctuating policies, the well-being of the Native American tribes is often disregarded in the interests of American expansion. Following the Treaty of New Dakota, the forced removal and the impacts of the Trail of Tears became more devastating than before, pushing the Cherokee toward their limits of physical and mental torture. Army Private John Burnett recounts his experience carrying up the Trail of Tears as an American soldier, stating, "Crimes were committed that were a disgrace to civilization. Men were shot in cold blood, lands were confiscated, homes were burned, and the inhabitants driven out by gold hunter brigands. As the culture and lands that had been cultivated for thousands of years were being destroyed in front of them, the only possible thing the Native Americans could do was remain silent and endure."
This period of American history, especially the Trail of Tears itself, represents the violent proceeding of American growth, during which no moral obligations seemed to matter. The removal of the Native Americans continued for years, killing thousands and destroying the wills of many more. Yet in 1871, the American government showed that they would not stop the destruction when Congress passed an Appropriations Act that reverted the Worcester v. Georgia laws and stripped all native nations of both their sovereignty as well as any protections granted to them from previous treaties, again considering them under the management of the United States. As of the 21st century, Native American reservations are currently all over the United States, attempting to preserve as much culture as possible. However, the current image of the government responsibilities expressed today can never atone for the neglected rights shown toward the original Americans. The truth stands that the rights created during the United States conception were never meant for the Native Americans to exercise and nearly resulted in their complete destruction.